Well, today, which is still 1st of December 2025, I have the somewhat unenviable task of trying to convey the last third of Jung's essay, which is the Introduction to Psychology and Alchemy. And I've already done the first two thirds of the essay, and so my request is that someone will watch those two because it's literally I'm jumping into the last third of it, and so th those two are the context for what is about to follow. Otherwise, I would say that Jung has been talking about the relationships between Christianity and psychology, particularly in the sort of exoteric and esoteric streams. So the relationship between the dogma of the church and Gnosticism and alchemy in particular, a bit of Hermeticism as well. And he basically wants to talk about how the two are balanced, how strands of each of them, both together, can express the wholeness of the center of personality and archetype, which he calls the self, which again is a kind of center of personality, which is between conscious and unconscious and includes our wholeness or totality, including the ego, but beyond it. And so for me, obviously, that's in the context of this. This is a symbol of an experience, and it sort of opened up for me in the form of a kind of Zen koan, this Gnostic phrase, one becomes two, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. And my sort of attempt to understand Jung is sort of in the light of both before, during, and after this kind of experience. And so today, the relevance of this is that Maria Prophetessa's quote shows up in what Jung wants to talk about. Indeed, I originally came across it in the text of Psychology and Alchemy, part two. And yeah, so I'm trying to describe what I'm trying to get at is what is the relevance of that quote? How can this sort of combination, this evolution of Christian symbolism in the light of the third millennium, how can it help? How can it serve as a way? And we're hoping that Jung will help to tell us. So with that as the only preamble that I'm going to give, and again, this is going to be difficult out of context, I will go into from page 197. This is in Murray Stein's Jung on Christianity from page 197 to 211, starting from paragraph 25 in Problems of Alchemy, which is the introduction to psychology and alchemy. Originally published around the 1950s, I believe. No, sorry, it was 1944. And what I'm going to be doing is simply reading part by part and trying to summarize and say what Jung means. I'm not necessarily evaluating. I might do a bit of that. Let's see. I'm just trying to understand what this impenetrable and obscure man has to share. And it's going to be difficult today. Let's see how this goes. So, from paragraph 25. Christianity has made the antinomy of good and evil into a world conflict, a world problem, and by formulating the conflict dogmatically, raised it to an absolute principle. Into this as yet unresolved conflict, the Christian is cast as a protagonist of good, a fellow player in the world drama. Understood in its deepest sense, being Christ's follower involves a suffering that is unendurable to the great majority of mankind. Okay, so what Jung is describing here is that there is a certain conflict between opposites, which here in the Christian culture is conceived as a conflict between good and evil, as an instance of the conflict. And Jung is pointing out that this conflict has been sort of absolutized, turned into a dogma, raised to a dramatic spiritual battle between good and evil, light and darkness, Christ and Antichrist. And that within that battle between good and evil, which I would say that we've inherited through, was it Mazdaism, Manichaeism, and Zoroastrianism? we're sort of cast into a certain role. We're cast into the role of a protagonist on the side of the light and the good. And that unfortunately, when we're cast in that role, directed to imitate Christ, this is very difficult. It's near impossible to follow him. And Jung feels, and this is with reference to the earlier section, that we kind of lack the emotional and spiritual space for inner conflict. We find it very difficult to hold paradox. And following in Christ's way involve tolerating the experience of crucifixion, being crucified between the tension between opposites. And we find that very difficult. Consequently, the example of Christ is in reality followed either with reservation or not at all. And the pastoral practice of the church even finds itself obliged to, quote, lighten the yoke of Christ. This means a pretty considerable reduction in the severity and harshness of the conflict, and hence, in practice, a relativism of good and evil. Okay, so he's saying that just because it's so difficult to imitate Christ in this way, in practice, the church, in a sense, waters down the conflict and gives us, sort of some free passes with the idea of moral probabilism, which we talked about last time, which is sort of like the idea of like, oh, it's okay to love God just before you die, or it's okay to love God just for like 5 years or something. There's a way that we, because of the severity of the task of imitating Christ, end up playing down the difficulty of the conflict. So, quote, good is equivalent to the unconditional imitation of Christ, and evil is its hindrance. So it's kind of made harder to fulfill in this way. Quote, man's moral weakness and sloth are what chiefly hinder the imitation, and it is to these that probabilism extends a practical understanding, which may sometimes perhaps come nearer to Christian tolerance, mildness, and love of one's neighbor than the attitude of those who see in probabilism a mere laxity. We'll keep going here. I don't want to get hung up on that too much. So, quote, although one must concede a number of cardinal Christian virtues to the probabilist endeavor, one must still not overlook the fact that it obviates much of the suffering involved in the imitation of Christ, and that the conflict of good and evil is thus robbed of its harshness and toned down to tolerable proportions. So what Jung really feels here, the main central point is that the imitation of Christ in the church tradition is extremely difficult. So we're asked to imitate him. Being a good Christian means to imitate Christ well. And to fail to do so through moral weakness and sloth and, sin and so on is, in a sense, evil or weak. Yep. And there's a way that it's very difficult for us to bear the absolutized conflict between good and evil. And the doctrine or the practice of moral probabilism, in a sense, robs the tension of its harshness and tones it down to tolerable proportions. And then Jung says, this brings about an approach to the psychic archetype of the self, where even these opposites seem to be united. Though, as I say, it differs from the Christian symbolism, which leaves the conflict open. Okay, so what Jung is pointing out is that if we find it so difficult to imitate the Christ archetype, well, we still end up in experiences of opposition and polarity. And if we don't experience that through imitating Christ, then we're going to experience it in a different way. And this is what Jung means by an approach to the archetype of the self. So just because we find it so difficult to actually imitate Christ, that doesn't mean that the archetype of the self is unavailable. On the contrary, it means it becomes more available because we can't imitate Christ. He says, yeah, it differs from the Christian symbolism, which leaves the conflict open. For the latter, Christian symbolism, there is a rift running through the world. Light wars against night and the upper against the lower. The two are not one as they are in the psychic archetype. But even though religious dogma may condemn the idea of two being one, religious practice does, as we've seen, allow the natural psychological symbol of the self, at one with itself, an approximate means of expression. So Jung is pointing out here that in some way the practice of the religious practice, seems in some way to be contrary to the dogma. So the dogma in some way condemns the idea of two being one. But in practice, the symbol of the self is allowed natural psychological expression. We're just going to keep going here. I know this bit is a bit difficult. So like, what is Jung talking about? What he says is, on the one hand, dogma insists that three are one, the Trinity, while denying that four are one. Since olden times, not only in the West, but also in China, uneven numbers been regarded as masculine and even numbers as feminine. The Trinity is therefore a decidedly masculine deity, of which the androgyny of Christ and the special position and veneration accorded to the Mother of God are not the real equivalent. With a statement which may strike the reader as peculiar, we come to one of the central axioms of alchemy, namely the saying of Maria Prophetessa, one becomes two, two becomes three, and out of the third comes the one as the fourth. Okay, I'm going to go through that part rather quickly. So basically what this is saying is that the dogma of the church, which is siding with the tradition, with the structure, with the institution, and here with the masculine, with the exoteric, with the collective, in a sense, collectivizing force. This is affirming the unity or oneness. It's also affirming the quality of threeness. It's also saying that one is three, three is one, the Trinity, that sort of thing. And Jung feels that this is sort of imbalanced toward the masculine. And he feels that alchemy and Hermeticism run as a kind of undercurrent that is compensatory, compensating, and that affirms the crucifixion between opposites, one and two. So it affirms the androgyny of Christ, his dual nature. And it also affirms the special position and veneration accorded to the Mother of God, which is symbolized within the archetype of the number four. So having more to do with the feminine in some sense. And so Jung feels that this axiom of Maria Prophetessa can describe a way in which these two different strands, the exoteric and the esoteric, the masculine and the feminine, the church dogma and the alchemists and Gnostics, can both contribute to a way. And so this is designed to correct the imbalance toward the masculine that we see, which is denied the nature of the body, the natural, the psyche, the feminine, and evil, all from inclusion within our understanding of the divine. And so the comparison with alchemy is designed to point to the reality of religious experience, religious practice, which involves both duality and unity, both trinity and quaternity, which is what Jung would feel is an empirical fact that is contra to the dogma. Okay, and he says, As the reader has already seen from its title, this book is concerned with the psychological significance of alchemy, and thus with a problem which, with very few exceptions, has so far eluded scientific research. Up until quite recently, science was interested only in the part that alchemy played in the history of chemistry, concerning itself very little with the part it played in the history of philosophy and religion. The importance of alchemy for the historical development of chemistry is obvious, but its cultural importance is still so little known that it seems almost impossible to say in a few words wherein that consisted. As in, we haven't recognized what the significance of alchemy is, blah, blah. And so he says, in this introduction, therefore, I've attempted to outline the religious and psychological problems which are germane to the theme of alchemy. Okay, so the point here being alchemy has a particular relevance, cultural relevance, relevance to religious practice that we haven't yet noticed. It pertains to certain particular problems in religion and psychology that Jung is attempting to lay out. Quote, the point is that alchemy is rather like an undercurrent to the Christianity that ruled on the surface. It is to the surface as the dream is to consciousness. Alchemy is to Christianity as dream is to consciousness. And just as the dream compensates the conflicts of the conscious mind, so alchemy endeavors to fill in the gaps left open by the Christian tension of opposites. Perhaps the most pregnant expression of this is the axiom of Maria Prophetessa quoted above, which runs like a leitmotif throughout almost the whole lifetime of alchemy, Western alchemy, this is, extending over more than 17 centuries. So again, this is to point to the central relevance of this quote and what it points to, what it means. The idea is that it points to a way that we haven't yet realized, that can, in some way, I would say, combine the, I don't know, strands that are found in the dogma and in the Gnostic heretic strands. I won't go on about it. I'm going to keep going. It says, in this aphorism, the even numbers, as in 2 and 4, which signify the feminine principle, the earth, the regions under the earth, and evil itself, they are interpolated between, I would just say placed between, the uneven numbers of the Christian dogma, the 1 and the 3. So then he wants to ask how they represented the 2 and the 4, archetypally speaking, let's say. He says, they are personified by the serpens Mercury, the mercurial serpent, the dragon that creates and destroys itself and represents the prima materia, the first matter. So he's talking about the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. This fundamental idea of alchemy points back to the Tehom, to Tiamat, with her dragon attribute, and thus to the primordial matriarchal world, which in the theomachy of the Marduk myth was overthrown by the masculine world of the father. So he's pointing back to the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth that involves, this is well documented in Peterson, it's like Tiamat is this, primordial dragon of chaos, earth mother type of deity, and Marduk who's the, light-bringing, sword wielding sun hero, overthrows her. And the idea is that this represents this time in history, namely this Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, and the overthrowing of Tiamat by Marduk represents a historical shift in the world's consciousness towards the masculine, which is from that time on compensated by the chthonic femininity of the unconscious. So Jung feels that this shift in religious history, which is in some way toward the masculine, toward the light side, the side of consciousness, again, this is archetypally speaking, corresponds with this shift toward consciousness itself, which is compensated within the unconscious. So I would say that on this topic, it may be Peterson's mistake may be to venerate that move. You know, Peterson and Campbell of others and Peterson and Campbell and others, they make much of the hero mythology. And I think the whole point is that, yes, we can sort of understand that this is an important development. It goes along with the development of modern consciousness and like that. And it's great. Heroism, yay. But we also kind of lost something. We also maybe lost the, I don't know, spiritual significance of the categories that have not been included. And that comes at a real cost, a cost we see compensated within the unconscious, within alchemy, within Gnosticism. And that's part of what Jung wants to explore. So that our religious symbols can be maybe more expressive of our wholeness rather than only part of our wholeness. Let's keep going. What does Jung say? He says, I'm trying to be thorough here. I was going faster through the rest of it, but it's so dense that I need to take it piece by piece. So he says, in certain pre-Christian religions, the differentiation of the masculine principle had taken the form of the father-son specification, a change which was to be of the utmost importance for Christianity. Okay, so he's simply pointing out that when we make this differentiating shift towards the masculine, towards the conscious, this is going on in the form of the divinization of the relationship between father and son. We see that that was important in Christianity and before Christianity, but particularly for Christianity. Now he says, were the unconscious merely complementary, this shift of consciousness would have been accompanied by the production of a mother and a daughter, for which the necessary material lay ready to hand in the myth of Demeter and Persephone. So he's saying, hey, well, if the unconscious was only making a complement to the conscious side, then the father and son would be matched by mother and daughter. And we already have the mythical material that which the unconscious could have sort of used. But he says, but as alchemy shows, the unconscious chose, again, it has qualities of autonomy. The unconscious chose rather the Cybele Attis type. And so just about that, Jung is referring to this other kind of myth, not the mother and the daughter myth, but the myth of Cybele and Attis is a Phrygian story about a mother goddess and her mortal consort. So she loved the shepherd Attis, but drove him to madness when he broke a vow of chastity. Overcome by madness, he castrated himself beneath a pine tree. His death led to Cybele's grief and the introduction of death into the world. But eventually she restored him to life, symbolizing nature's rebirth. So it's a different kind of myth. And so what Jung is saying about this is that this kind of myth took a certain form. He says that it took a form of the prima materia and the, quote, filius macrocosmi. Filius macrocosmi, the son of the macrocosm. I can't say what he means by that. What he wants to point out is that the unconscious is not complementary, but compensatory. There's a way that, imagine that the conscious half of the personality is holding up the left hand. Well, the unconscious doesn't just hold up the right hand like this. It kind of does like this. It kind of makes a complementing move. Sorry, a compensating move. And he says about this, this goes to show that the unconscious does not simply act contrary to the conscious mind, but modifies it in more in the manner of an opponent or partner. So it's a kind of responder in a dance. Then he says, the son type does not call up a daughter as a complementary image from the depths of the chthonic unconscious. It calls up another son. So it doesn't just do the opposite thing. It makes a compensating move, like the responding move in a dance. He says, this remarkable fact would seem to be connected with the incarnation in our earthly human nature of a purely spiritual God. brought about by the Holy Ghost impregnating the womb of the Blessed Virgin. Okay, so what he's talking about here is that the myth of the sort of father and son that we see in Christianity is in some way compensated within the unconscious by the kind of alchemical myth of the prima materia, the first matter, and the filius macrocosmi, the son of the macrocosm, which is in some way not a complement, but a compensating move by the unconscious. And he feels that this is in some way connected with the, as he said, incarnation in our earthly human nature of a purely spiritual God. Okay, so I stopped for a bit and we're at a key junction. I need to try and explain what Jung means by this compensating action of the unconscious. Again, we're basically talking about the exoteric and the esoteric, the church dogma and the alchemical and Gnostic tradition, which runs as a compensating undercurrent. This is also expressed in the conscious and unconscious sort of forms of religious expression. And so in the upper of those two, we see this spiritualized relationship of the masculine between the Father and the Son in terms of God the Father and Christ the Son. And we see that this is compensated in by the action of the unconscious, which gives rise to an equivalent son rather than to a daughter. It's sort of rather than the spirit incarnating as a son, the earthly matter compensates as a different kind of son. This is a kind of compensation. And so Jung tries to go into the dynamics of this specific compensation in another way. Firstly, he was describing how the sort of mythology of alchemy and Gnosticism describes this compensating movement of the initial matter of the prima materia uh, becoming or fulfilling itself as the filius macrocosmi, the son of the macrocosm. And this is in some way compensating directly the Father incarnating as Christ. So the prima materia, I guess, incarnates the son of the macrocosm. Okay, so how else can we describe this dynamic that Jung would like to relate? Well, I thought I paused that, but I didn't. So first of all, he describes the initial dynamic. So on the part of consciousness, there is this initiating move, initiating action. And it's this this notion of a purely spiritual God, which incarnates in our earthly human nature. And well, how does this come about, this initial movement? Well, it comes about through the Holy Ghost, who impregnates the womb of the Blessed Virgin. And so the symbolism here is for the higher and the spiritual and the masculine to quote incline down toward the lower, toward the earthly and toward the feminine. This is the dynamic of within the world of the Father. It's the initiating action of the masculine consciousness. So that was the initial move, and then Jung wants to describe again the compensating move by the unconscious. And so now he describes the world of the mother. And just to be clear about what I was just saying, the way that the son is an incarnation of the father is in some way corresponding, that goes along with the Marduk myth in a certain way. It's also expressive of that. So anyway, now this compensating move by the the world of the mother. So Jung says that she's anterior to the world of the father. So the way that she surrounds and encompasses even the world of the father. And she does this compensating movement. Well, how does she do that? She responds to the movement of the masculine principle by accommodating herself in such a way as to produce a son, the quote chthonic counterpart of Christ rather than his antithesis. So it's not so whereas the Father, God the Father, becomes a divine man, the mother, the earthly mother, produces a son who's not divine or spiritual, but conforms to the nature of the primordial mother in a certain way. So just as the Father comes down into a person, Christ, so the mother comes up into a person, known in alchemy as the filius macrocosmi, son of the macrocosm. And so this occurs with the aid of the human spirit, quote. So I'm going to read Jung's sentence, which is a long one. He said, thus, the higher spiritual and masculine, this is the initial move of the masculine world, inclines to the lower earthly and feminine in terms of the Holy Ghost impregnating the Blessed Virgin. And then, accordingly, the mother, who was anterior to the world of the Father, accommodates herself to the masculine principle, and with the aid of the human spirit, alchemy, or the philosophy, produces a son. Not the antithesis of Christ, but rather his chthonic counterpart. Not a divine man, but a fabulous being, conforming to the nature of the primordial mother. Now he describes how this chthonic counterpart to Christ has an analogous task. The resulting son has an analogous task. He says, and just as the redemption of man as the microcosm is the task of the upper son, so the lower son has the function of the salvator macrocosmi, the savior of the macrocosm. So that's quite interesting dynamic to me. So what he's describing is that each of these incarnations serves a certain role, and Jung feels that their role corresponds to the dynamic between microcosm and macrocosm. So the divine or the spiritual in some way corresponds to the inner, the salvation or redemption of man as the microcosm, whereas the Earth Mother, sort of her alchemical incarnation, her production of the chthonic counterpart to Christ, his role seems to be to do with the redemption or salvation of the macrocosm. So in some way, the outside or the exterior, the external, rather than the within. Okay, so that summarizes that. And now, what does Jung say afterwards? He says, this, in brief, is the drama that was played out in the obscurities of alchemy. It is superfluous to remark that these two sons were never united, except perhaps in the mind and innermost experience of a few particularly gifted alchemists. But it is not very difficult to see the purpose of this drama. In the incarnation of Christ, it looked as though the masculine principle of the father world were approximating to the feminine principle of the mother world. So there's a way that what he's saying is that in the incarnation, it seemed as if the divine masculine is approximating to, which is in some way going down into the incarnate earthly body, right? Quote, with the result that the latter, the mother world, felt impelled to approximate in turn to the father world. So there's a way that the father sort of, in a humbling way, lowers himself down to the level of divine man being incarnate in an earthly body. And the mother world responds by coming up to the same level, to the human level. Quote, what it evidently amounted to was an attempt to bridge the gulf separating the two worlds as compensation for the open conflict between them. So obviously we have this archetypal myth of this conflict between two divine beings, such as masculine and feminine, or heaven and earthly, for example. And the idea that itself is not only that the movement of the conscious side is compensated by movement in the unconscious side, not only this, but a different kind of compensation, which is that there's open conflict between the two sides, and this open conflict between the two sides is compensated with this approximating relationship from each of them toward the other, which is a kind of undercurrent of role reversal. The world of the mother goes up toward the father, toward the spiritual, and the father world comes down toward the earth. And so he says, I hope the reader will not be offended if my exposition sounds like a Gnostic myth. We are moving in those psychological regions where, as a matter of fact, gnosis is rooted. The message of the Christian symbol is gnosis. And the compensation affected by the unconscious is gnosis in even higher degree. So there's a way that gnosis is raised by both sides. The process is, there's a reciprocal opening, or I could say opponent processing dynamic, where, as he said, the message of the Christian symbol is gnosis. What went along with each of these moves is gnosis, and that gets raised to higher and higher degrees each time. Then he says, myth is the primordial language natural to these psychic processes, and no intellectual formulation comes anywhere near the richness and expressiveness of mythical imagery. Such processes are concerned with the primordial images, and these are best and most succinctly reproduced by figurative language. Again, he's saying that yes, gnosis is raised by both sides. Myth expresses this dynamic far better than sort of intellectual formulation can, which is why he's speaking in this sort of mythic archetypal way. So it's become quite arcane quite quickly. So how does he want to continue? He says, the process described above displays all the characteristic features of psychological compensation. So it's as if the whole world were the psyche, the whole cosmos is a psyche. We know that the mask of we know that the mask of the unconscious is not rigid. It reflects the face we turn towards it. Hostility lends it a threatening aspect. Friendliness softens its features. It's not a question of mere optical reflection, but of an autonomous answer. An answer which has autonomy, the unconscious choosing to respond in that way. it's not a question of mere optical reflection, but of an autonomous answer which reveals the self-sufficing nature of that which answers. There's a way that the unconscious is sufficient unto itself. It has its own agency, its own self-sufficiency. Quote, thus, the filius philosophorum, the son of the philosophers, or which is the same as the so compensating incarnation from the world of the mother. It's um, this another son, this compensating figure to Christ, is not just the reflected image in unsuitable material of the Son of God. On the contrary, this son of Tiamat reflects the features of the primordial maternal figure. Although he is decidedly hermaphroditic, he has a masculine name, son of the philosophers, a sign that the chthonic underworld, having been rejected by the spirit and identified with evil, has a tendency to compromise. There is no mistaking the fact that he is a concession to the spiritual and masculine principle, even though he carries in himself the weight of the earth and the whole fabulous nature of primordial animality. Okay, so what he intended to say with this is that this compensating son, which is produced by the unconscious, by the world of the mother, by Tiamat, this son of Tiamat, is not a pure reflection of Christ and not a lesser reflection of Christ, but it reflects the features of the primordial feminine in the same way that Christ reflects the features of the primordial masculine. Accordingly, he has qualities such as, although he has a masculine name, he has the quality of he's hermaphroditic, carries within himself the weight of the earth, and quote, the whole fabulous nature of primordial animality. And so Jung said that he was a compensation because it's a response to the initiating move of the masculine world of the father. Okay, again, this is quite arcane. I'm going to do a bit more here. And so he says, this answer of the mother world shows that the gulf between it and the father world is not unbridgeable, seeing that the unconscious holds the seed of the unity of both. Okay, I have to try and talk about what this means. It actually doesn't have to be too complicated. It can simply be that it seems that the descent of the father world into the human level is matched by the ascent of the mother world also into the human level. So there's a way that the level of the human or the soul, which is in between sort of the masculine father spirit world and the feminine mother earth world, fulfills both in a certain way. And accordingly, the gap is not unbridgeable. The tendency of, yeah, as he says, the essence of the conscious mind is discrimination. It must, if it is to be aware of things, separate the opposites. And it does this contra nature. So the unconscious unifies, whereas the conscious divides or discriminates. And that's why he feels that the unconscious holds the seed of the unity of both. As he says, in nature, the opposites seek one another. The extremes meet. And so it is in the unconscious, and particularly in the archetype of unity. the self. Here, as in the deity, the opposites cancel out. But as soon as the unconscious begins to manifest itself, they split asunder, as at the creation. For every act of dawning consciousness is a creative act. And it is from this psychological experience that all our cosmogonic symbols are derived. So what I gathered, I mean, this is obviously quite complex and it's really hard to summarize this. Essentially, what he's saying is that to be conscious is to create. And there's a way that the nature of our consciousness is in terms of polarity, duality, discrimination. And the unconscious world compensates with this sort of underlying archetype of unity, the self. But when it manifests, when it arises in the form of polarity. And that's a kind of that arising, the actualizing, sort of manifesting images of God. Okay, so this is significantly later, and I just want to summarize and finish, and then come back to this afterwards. So I'm just going to summarize the last paragraph that Jung was saying. I got about 2 pages through this, quite a denser part of his introduction. He says, the answer of the mother world shows that the gulf between it and the father world is not unbridgeable, seeing that the unconscious holds the seed of the unity of both. The essence of the conscious mind is discrimination. It must, if it is to be aware of things, separate the opposites. And it does this contra nature. In nature, the opposites seek one another, the extremes meet. And so it is in the unconscious. And particularly in the archetype of unity, the self. Here, as in the deity, the opposites cancel out. But as soon as the unconscious begins to manifest itself, they split asunder, as at the creation. For every act of dawning consciousness is a creative act. And it is from this psychological experience that all our cosmogonic symbols are derived. From here, I would simply take the summary that to be conscious is to create, and that's an inherently discriminating activity, and that the experience of totality, wholeness, and unity goes along with the combined experience of consciousness and unconsciousness. It's a little bit tricky because we can't exactly experience consciousness, but the point is that the conscious experience of the self manifests in the form of the God image. In the symbol of Christ, as the symbol of the Buddha, mandalic symbols of the self, which are cross-culturally pointing to the same underlying phenomena. The unconscious unifies and consciousness discriminates, but the self includes and transcends all opposites. One way of talking about the human situation is in terms of the father world, the masculine world of heaven, and the mother world, the feminine world of the earth. And the world of man, the world of mankind, bridges between them. And this is in some way I would consider a reasonable way to conceive our purpose. I'll leave it here for the moment.